everybody. I'm Dan Tuber, your host for today. Welcome to the Shotgun Podcast, brought to you by Acumen, an exclusive community of CEOs and business owners to help you grow your top line, optimize your bottom line, and enrich your storyline. On this episode, we're going to talk about going from president to CEO, or taking over when your name's not on the door. If you're a key executive and have the opportunity to buy in or buy out a founder, or if you're a founder thinking about selling your company to a key employee, this episode is for you. I'm with one of the most buttoned up, prepared, diligent, spreadsheetist CEOs who's part of the Excel team in Kansas City. His name is Darin Heyen, and he's the owner of Pearce Construction, which is he bought from the founder, Don Pearce. So welcome, Darin. Good to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. I don't know if that was an insult or a compliment. We'll figure that out later, I guess.
Right on. Which one? Which part?
All of it. Spreadsheet.
All of it. So what do you do and who do you do it for?
Well, I am president and CEO of Pearce Construction. I'm actually a licensed architect. I practiced architecture for about 5 years before when I graduated from school, and joined Pearce Construction back in 1995. So I'm starting my 30th year. I really began as an entry-level project manager. Worked my way up to vice president, became president about 15 years after I started, as I began my leadership and ownership journey with Don Pearce. And I've been the sole owner for about 5 years, but a majority owner for over 10. So it's been an interesting ride.
So your last name is Heyen, not Pearce, and yet you run Pearce Construction. What's that about?
That is true. Well, as a commercial general contractor, another history about our company, Dan, is we've been around since 1953. So we've been in business for 73 years. We build owner-occupied buildings. We don't build for the government. We do typically private work. We do about $25 million a year. But again, Heyen's not on the door. Construction companies are notorious for having the owner's names as a part of the company name and logo. But I always wanted to build a company that was more about the company rather than the individual. I remember walking into meetings, and whenever Don Pearce would walk in, the immediate focus shifted to him because his name was on the door. And I really wanted to build a culture in a company where it was about the brand, not necessarily the person behind the brand. And to be quite honest, no one can pronounce the word Heyen. So I thought Pearce Construction, along with the blue sky that it carried, as a very reputable general contractor in Kansas City, it was kind of foolish of me to think about changing the name. It was interesting. I had several colleagues and friends that really wanted me to change the name, but I didn't have that ego. I didn't need that. And again, I thought about the next time I transitioned the company, how would that transition go? So 71 years in Kansas City is a pretty good run. I don't want to disrupt that.
Tell me more about Don Pearce.
So yeah, Don has been a friend, a mentor, a father figure. Don was also an architect that practiced with a firm here in town for about 10 years. It was a firm called Linscott, Haylett, Wimmer, and Wheat, and a lot of the Kansas City architectural firms were born out of that company. Don's father was in banking and also commercial real estate, and Don always had a passion for the construction side. He and I developed a relationship as I was the project architect working on a branch bank here in Kansas City. I was always intrigued why he made the jump from architecture to construction. Actually had conversations with my wife I remember it was a Thursday night almost 30 years ago, and said, I wonder why Don got out of architecture and got into construction. And lo and behold, the very next day I went to a meeting where Don was present, and he asked me to stay after. And I immediately thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble with the principal here. What did I do? And he asked me to shut the door, and he said, hey, do you ever think about getting into construction? And that kind of started our relationship. Architecture, you either fall on kind of the highly design-oriented side of the process, or more the technical side. And Don and I both kind of fell on that technical side. We really enjoyed watching the project getting built, being a part of that process as opposed to the design. So Don and I really had a kind of a father-son type relationship. We both lost our fathers at very young ages when we were in our 20s. So I don't think he would mind me saying, but I was kind of the son that he never had. And I looked up to Don. I mean, he was, Don was this ultimate gentlemanly figure, very well respected, he was incredibly generous. Don was really a visionary for the company, not so involved in the nuts and bolts and in the weeds, but really the visionary that led the company. So Don and I developed a relationship. We had a lot of mutual respect for each other. That man treated me like a partner from the day I walked in the door, and I just always respected that about him. So, Don was the kind of guy that was always open to conversation, very open to a policy, very even keel. Construction ebbs and flows from a workload, profitability, economy standpoint, and he just had a real knack for not letting his emotions show in business. And I just learned a lot from that. And he really invested in the people that we had here, and that's what I loved about him. Don's still around today. We'll see Don around the office about once a month. He'll stop in and say hi. He had an office up until about 2 weeks ago, where we finally grew to a point where we had to take over his office. But we honored Don and Chester Dean both by naming our training room and our conference room after the other two owners of the company, and kind of surprised them with some plaques on the wall. And it's just been a nice tribute to those two gentlemen that owned it before I did.
So, when was the first time that the conversation came up about purchasing the company or becoming an owner?
Probably after I'd been here literally for only about 6 or 7 years. I kind of paid my dues. I landed in the middle of this triangle of three gentlemen that really helped me mold my career. Don Pearce was a visionary leader of the company. There was Doug Anderson, who was the vice president at the time, that could run 10 projects at a time with his hair on fire, and John Dent, who could only run one project at a time, but everything was perfectly, it was on time, under budget, happy client, happy architect. It was exactly the way you would want to run the project. So I landed in the middle of these three guys, and all these guys were 20 plus years older than I was. So whether I was lucky enough, smart enough, dumb enough, I was fortunate enough to ask all those gentlemen questions, and they poured into me just because I was curious, and I took the initiative to want to learn. And it became pretty evident over the first, 5 or 6 years, as I said, that everyone started to say, he's the guy that could probably take it over from Don and run with it. So I'd say probably 5 to 6 years into my career, we began some conversations about what transition and ownership would look like. And that's how it really all started. But it's tough. I mean, construction companies are notorious for failing as they transition to the next level of leadership, and more so when it's family involved. And you've all heard the messy stories of when families, sons or daughters and cousins and aunts and uncles get involved in business, it can get really, really messy. So I think Chester Dean and Don Pearce both realized, even though they had sons and daughters, some were involved in the business, some were not. But it became pretty obvious that Don wanted to take it in a direction for me. And Don really set in motion a process to allow me to get into business economically with some risk, but I didn't have to mortgage the farm, as they say, to get into it. So he was very gracious with the entire process.
Say more about construction companies are notorious for failing in the transition. How come?
Well, it's one of those things. You got to have passion, Dan. I mean, if you don't have passion for what you're doing, it's not going to work. And so many times in construction companies, when a son or daughter begins working for the company, do they have that same passion that the owner and the founder and the one that grew the company had? And it was pretty obvious that in both of those situations, that was not present. And I think Don and Chester Dean, the original founder of the company, they recognized that. I remember when we were talking to Don about the possibility of, joining him. Again, I was a practicing architect. I thought if I do this for a year or two and it's not what I think it is, I can go back to architecture and I'd be a better architect having seen the construction side of things. But my wife really pulled a curveball on Don during dinner one night as we were meeting with Don and Linda about this. She flat out asked the question, you have a son, what's his plan for the business? When I started, my goal wasn't to go in and buy the thing. I had a passion for construction, and I thought it looked very interesting to me. I liked the way the days and weeks and months went by on the construction side versus the architecture side. But my intent when I first met Don was not to go in and buy the thing and be the owner. I never wanted to own a construction company, but God has a sense of humor and led me to this path where now one of the things I didn't mention earlier is we built a lot of faith-based buildings. We've done over 150 churches in Kansas City alone, and it's just a real honor to get to do that. So that's kind of how the whole process started.
All right, so these things always start slow. You have to date for a while before you get married, but at some point you have to sit down and talk process, numbers, negotiating. How did those conversations go? Who led? It's hard to purchase from the founder when it's his baby, his name on the door.
It did. It had its challenges. I would say I approached Don. I knew that at that stage of my career that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to take that next step and become more of a leader in the company. So I approached Don. One of the things that's difficult about a construction company is there's a tremendous amount of liability of past projects that are built. So it wasn't as simple as assigning a value to the company. A construction company multiplier for purchase is it's not very strong. A construction company is not really, it's not like an accounting firm where you have repeat clients year after year after year. A construction company is really a vehicle of people, processes, and relationships. It's all about getting the next job. And if you can't get the next job, you can't make any money. You can't stay in business. So it's all about, making rain and about getting into it. One of the things I was most concerned about is, hey, here's a 50+ year history of projects that are built. What if there's a problem with one of those buildings and there's a lawsuit? Maybe someone slips and falls in a building and Pearce Construction Company gets sued. Am I on the hook because I just bought the company? And the answer was yes. There is that long-term liability that we have to be aware of. So what Don and I came up with was, how do we start a new company that I owned that did not have the liability and risk of what he had built over the past several decades? So we actually came up with a model. So remember, Don Pearce owned Pearce Construction Company. We started a new company called Pearce Construction Management, which I owned. And slowly over a 9-year period, we would get a new job into the office and we would decide, okay, which company does that one go in? And the model was to kind of shift at 10% a year over a 9-year period, where after year 5, more of the volume was being done in my company versus his company. We set up an administrative services agreement, and we would look at the percentage of volume that went into each company every year, and we would distribute that administrative cost to each company. So a very simple way to use the same staff, set up a different company, release me of the liability so that I could get into business. The other thing I would say that made ours very, very successful was Don didn't come to me and say, oh, you want to buy in? I need a check for $5 million. He knew that I didn't have the capacity to do that. Because of our relationship and we cared about each other, he said, let's do this kind of together. Why don't we start very, very small? Again, at 10% in year 1, you don't need a lot of cash to operate that size of a company at that time. So I was able to put in cash that Lauren and I had saved to invest in Pearce Construction Management. And that's how we started the company, and it grew over time. And Don knew over that 9-year period, we would build enough equity in Pearce Construction Management that then I could fly on my own when he exited the company at that point in time. So it was very generous of him to not ask me to sign in blood on the dotted line. It allowed me to get into business, and I'm forever thankful for that. I mean, he did me a wonderful favor back then.
Okay, so this is a long transition from the founder, which is a blessing in some ways, right? Because you didn't have to write a check, but in other ways, challenging. So one day you're number 2, and then one day in a bit of a process, you're number 1. What was that transition like?
Yeah, several comments on that. First of all, when Don transitioned with Chester Dean, it was done over a very short period of time, just a couple of years. Don wrote the big check. Chester went down to Arkansas and retired, but Chester still retained some own. He was guaranteed a percentage of profits. Well, Don took the company and it took off. And Chester came back and said, "Hey, I'd like to extend this another few years." And Don said, "Well, I don't want to. This is really good for you, but not good for me." So that was a very short transition, which I think had some bumps in the road, and I think a little bit adversarial between the two as it got into year 2 and possibly 3. But when Don and I set up this 9-year transition, again, a lot of people advised me and said, that's a long time. I don't know if I'd do that. Well, the trade-off was I didn't have to dump a bunch of cash into the company to get started. So yeah, it was I'd say the first 2 or 3 years, no big deal. Don's still the majority owner. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to process everything that's going through my head and with the company. But then when I got to year 5, all of a sudden I'm the majority owner. More work is going into my company than his, but yet he's still around the office a lot. And I would walk into meetings and everyone looks at Don Pearce and not me. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I'm on the hook here, not him. So there was a little bit of a challenge with, he enjoyed being Don Pearce around the office, but it was my decision and I was the one liable for it. So that was a little bit challenging. But again, on that back half of the deal, Don really started to transition to, I would say, a different lifestyle, taking 2 to 3 months off in the winter, going down to Florida for an extended period of time. So I was, in a sense, running the company, even though he retained 20, 30, or 40% ownership in those last few years. But I would say towards the very, very end, it got a little bit awkward. He still wanted to be involved in some critical decisions. And I would say the thing about Don and I is we both respected each other enough. We listened to each other and we made good business decisions together. But it was challenging towards the end. I would say the 9-year process was a bit long by the time it was all said and done. And a lot of people asked me, well, did it work out exactly the way you wanted it to? And I'd say, no, it didn't. I think financially it worked out better for Don over that 9-year period, because even though you want to transition a certain percentage of work per year in a construction company with 2, 3, 4, and $5 million jobs, the percentages just never worked out. And they always worked out a little bit better in his company's favor than mine. But again, at the end of the day, I looked at it and said, look, I was set up in business. I didn't have to invest millions and millions of dollars to get into it. I'm okay with him coming out a little bit better than I did on the deal.
So when was the first time you felt like, oh, I'm the CEO of this, like this is my ship?
When I became majority owner. I mean, that's really when it happened. I mean, it's like, okay, now the safety net is somewhat removed. I'd say that's probably when it really felt like mine. And then I think the other time it really felt like mine was when he exited the company completely, when I bought the office building and all the equipment, which was at the end of that 9-year period. That's when I was like, okay, I'm flying solo right now. And it was fun, exhilarating, scary, nerve-wracking, all the emotions. But I remember, Dan, when we signed the initial agreement, I remember our attorney, and we used the same attorney, which again, people would say, why did you do that? Well, he'd been with the company a long time. He knew us. He knew what we were trying to accomplish, really trusted him. There's a lot of trust in this deal, Dan. I mean, I was advised a lot, make him sign a non-compete. I'm like, come on, guys, we've worked together for 20 years. This is okay. But I remember our attorney saying we signed the papers on the transition in the new company, and our attorney looked at me and he said, well, it's the end and the beginning. And I was like, what are you talking about? I just started this deal. He goes, nope, this is the end. That's done. Now you got to figure out a way to get out in 5 to 10 years. So that's kind of where I find myself now. I've been doing it, I've been a majority owner for over 10 years. I'm 56 years old. I'm not going to work forever, but I still want to work some more time. So now I'm in the process of trying to figure out who is that next leader? How does that transition work for me? How do I deal with the sale of buildings and equipment and all the other stuff that we own? So it's been a fun ride.
All right. So you have a unique perspective because you know have both mindsets, right? So if you were to give a person in the key executive slot advice on having this discussion, what advice would you give the young you?
I would say be honest with yourself. Is this really what you want? Do you really understand what your next role is going to look like? Because so many people get into a business, I don't care what industry it is, you're in the weeds, you're a producer, you're making good money, you're making decisions. But when you move to the ownership side and now you're financially on the hook for everything, it can be a grind. You've got to understand people, business, finances. There's just so many things that have nothing to do with construction that I have to deal with every single day. Not sure school can really prepare you for that either. I have a degree in architecture. I know construction and architecture. Now all of a sudden I'm a business owner. So I would say really, be yourself, be honest with yourself, think about what that day-to-day role really looks like. Because I'm not involved in the day-to-day construction operations anymore, things that I can do in my sleep. But now I'm in new waters. I still find myself in new waters. The other thing I would say is it's a team sport. You got your spouse or your partner really needs to be on board with what you're diving into. It's really challenging. One of the things Don said to me very early on, after we started this process, is he said, "You're now on an island. You will be a sole owner. You don't have a board of directors. Everything lies with you. You will make the decisions." And he said one of the things that he struggled with early in his ownership was he didn't have anyone to go to. You can't really go to some of your employees because they work for you. They may be yes men or women. You can't really go home to your spouse because they don't understand the industry or the business. He goes, it's kind of lonely at the top. And I didn't really understand that when he said it, but I did realize that, within the last 7 or 8 years, there's certain decisions owners have to make, and it's gray. It's not black and white. And sometimes it's a long-term decision versus a short-term solution. A lot of times, we may have an issue on a project or with an employee, and we may be in the right, but sometimes you got to lose that battle to win the war. So a lot of times people that see black and white don't understand that. So that's probably one of the hardest things I've had to deal with individually.
Oh, all right. Now put your current hat on as you now are looking at the next 5 to 10. What are you thinking about, and what advice would you give the founder owner with the name on the door about transitioning?
You got to look for the passion. I mean, someone's got to be in it for the right reasons. You can't be in it just for the money or the ego. If that's the case, don't do it. What I look for around the office with who the next level of leadership, what it's going to look like, because it's people that treat people the way I want them to be treated. It's people that are treating our clients and our architects. That's what's going to make the company successful. It's not necessarily the great project manager that's highly profitable. It's got to be more of a people person. And I think it takes time. You cannot learn this business specifically at Pearce or any other industry in a year or two. I mean, it does take some time before you're ready to take that leadership position on. So we've identified what that next generation of leadership looks like in our company. And we're now having discussions, as Don and I did, about what does that time frame look like and how's that going to be driven.
A lot of wisdom in there, Hein. I dig it.
I don't know about
Uh,
that.
okay, bonus question. How are you being sharpened, challenged, and inspired as a business owner currently? What are you doing?
Well, not to pump you. I know probably 8 years ago, Case Dorman of Jack Stack Barbecue called me out of the blue. I'd known Case for a few years, wanted to go out for coffee, and he told me about this group called Acumen. He goes, I think it'd be great for you. I think it'd be great for your business. And we talked for a couple of hours, and I said, Case, I love what you're saying. And I said, nope, not going to do it. And we shook hands, and that was it. That was it. And then 2 years later, Travis Carpenter, who's the current president of Jack Stack, called me and he said, hey, you're going to join this Acumen group that I'm going to be a part of. And I did. So, when it's, how am I sharpened, challenged, and inspired? Um, you know, as a sole business owner, you lack the camaraderie of business partners that understand what you're going through. Acumen became a place where I was with other business owners. And what I quickly realized was whatever industry we were in, we were all facing the same challenges with people, relationships, contracts, banking. All those challenges are the same in different industries. Acumen really gave me this platform to have some people I could bounce ideas off of and get honest feedback. And that's what you really need is honest feedback. So I look back at the way I've been sharpened. Acumen's been a big part of it, just from a leadership perspective to a business perspective. Acumen's made me a better husband and a father. I wish I should have taken it when Case offered it 2 years prior, but that's how I really find my inspiration. At this point in time.
Hold on, Hein. That's good stuff. So, where can listeners find out more about you if they want to go check out Pearce?
Well, obviously our website, pearceconstruction.com, all of our social media channels are there. So if people would like to reach out to us, there's links to all our social media channels, my email address, and would love to talk to anyone that's interested in building our type of building.
Awesome. I appreciate your wisdom today, sharing your journey and opening the kimono to both sides of that puzzle. So if you're interested in becoming a member of Acumen, go to acumenimpact.com, click on the apply button, or if you'd like to learn more, we have a ton of great content under the resources tab, including podcasts like this one. Darin Heyen, thank you very much. And we'll see you guys all next time.
Thanks, Dan.